Welcome to Aging Wisely, the podcast, a show that aims to center the lives and needs of the aging and disabled communities, a platform for the issues that matter to them most, a space for them and those who work with and alongside them. I am Veronica Escobar, the producer and host. My goal is to educate and transform. Cristian Gonzalez-Rivera is the Director of Strategic Policy Initiatives at the Brookdale Center for Healthy Aging, which is part of Hunter College of the City of New York's Aging Research and Policy and Professional Development Center. He has a bachelor degree in urban studies and a graduate degree in urban planning. Since graduating with his master's degree from NYU, he has dedicated his career to think more about society, how people access opportunity, and the haves and have-nots. The focus of our interview was his work at the Center for Urban Future here in New York City. He told me that he wanted to do research that then turned into action, putting it in the hands of the people who can actually make change. While he worked at the Center for Urban Future, he researched and authored what I consider to be an incredibly insightful and important research project called The New Face of New York Seniors. It focuses on the older immigrants in this city. Who are they? What are their struggles? What can New York, or any city for that matter, do to make their older residents' lives easier? These are some of his thoughts on the work.
Our research, our policy analysis, and our policy advocacy, our professional development, all of that work is really aimed towards making sure that everyone, regardless of where they're from, regardless of their socioeconomic status, making sure that everyone can age as well as anyone can. There's no one way to age well. There's no one way of how to do healthy aging. In fact, aging really depends on where you've been in your life. I mean, it's like if you've had a difficult life, if you've had an experience of immigration, if you have been living in the United States while Black, all of these parts of your life go into when you get older. These are things that you age with. And all of that has to be taken into account when you think about what is the very best way that somebody can reach older age.
How long did it take for you and the team that you were working with to compile the data that you would need to write this report, which is quite a substantial report? Not necessarily in the number of pages, although it's pretty long. It's substantial in the sense that it says a lot and it gives you a lot of food for thought.
The Center for an Urban Future was a really small organization. At the time that I was there were 8 people. And so that meant that I was spearheading the work and sometimes working with one intern or maybe 2 interns doing the project. So a lot of that data analysis I did myself. The whole project took about 1.5 years. Just from conceptualizing it to doing the data analysis to doing almost 60 interviews with everyone ranging from the commissioner of the Department of the Aging all the way to caseworkers and frontline workers who work directly with older adults in neighborhoods across the city. Of course, when we're talking about immigrants, we're not talking about one group of people. We're talking about lots of different people. So those interviews in all 5 boroughs, in all the major ethnic groups in the city, really talking to organizations that work with those groups to find out what those separate challenges were. So it was a pretty big undertaking. And then, of course, there was the big job of weaving that all together into the report that you see.
There are about 3.2 million older people living in New York City. I think that figure was from 2016. In your report, and I'm not exactly clear when it was published, you cite that half of older people in New York City are from immigrant backgrounds. That's a lot of older people.
And in fact, that in itself was the number one statistic that was shocking to a lot of people. And even when I started the research, I started crunching some numbers and I found that, and I said, wow, I wasn't entirely surprised, but what I was surprised by is when I started to do a literature search, because I thought, well, I mean, if half of older adults in New York City are immigrants, surely people have written about this. At the time, it was 2012, there were almost no research reports that even mentioned the fact that so many older adults in New York City are foreign born. To me, the question was, how is it that half of older adults can be invisible? That was a big sort of finding for me in this work.
It's interesting that you use the word invisible because in your report, you talk specifically about the plight of undocumented older people. And when you think about an invisible population in our society, the undocumented are definitely invisible to a lot of people. And oftentimes they make themselves invisible on purpose. So I think I'll start here. In your report, you talk about a lot of the barriers that older immigrants face, the age when they migrated, whether they were ever employed, whether they were ever able to earn an income, what language issues did they have? There are so many issues that immigrants deal with. So I'd like you to spend a few minutes just talking about your research and the major factors that you examined when you were putting this report together.
Well, one thing that's pretty clear. There are many different challenges that immigrants face, but even when talking about challenges, it's impossible to talk about older immigrants as a group. You know, every region or country of origin group has its own challenges that could be very different from those of other regions or countries of origin. And so, in fact, that makes the challenge of serving or reaching older immigrants, the challenge is really its diversity. The number one challenge that you can think of is, of course, the cultural and linguistic differences. One of the other major challenges is the fact that 24% of older immigrants live below the federal poverty line in New York City. And that's compared to 15% of older adults who were born in the United States. The average income of the older immigrant is about half that of the average US born older adult.
The next thing Christian told me was something I already knew, but to have him speak on it really brought it home: the scarcity that some older immigrants live with.
One of the big reasons is that 1 out of every 3 older immigrants receives nothing in Social Security. And so think about that. I mean, think about how important Social Security is to so many older adults. And yet 1 out of every 3 older immigrants in New York City receive nothing in Social Security. And often that's because they didn't work the required 10 years in covered employment. Sometimes this is because they arrived in the US later, so they didn't have a chance to work those 10 years. Other times it's because they only had jobs that they were able to get off the books, such as jobs in construction or in childcare or maintenance. And some of them spent their years as homemakers, taking care of their children's children. But even among those who did work in covered employment, many immigrants worked lower wage jobs, which of course translates to smaller Social Security checks and other retirement benefits on average. There's many structural reasons why many immigrant groups have lower income than their US born counterparts. Now, that being said, poverty and other challenges vary pretty significantly by country or region of origin. For instance, older immigrants from Mexico, Dominican Republic, China, and several countries of the former Soviet Union are on average among the poorest in the city, with more than 1 out of every 3 living in poverty. In contrast, immigrants from Japan and several Western European nations are on average doing better even than US born older adults. So in fact, they're all immigrants, but they're in very different places. However, something that is very crucial is the fact that the poorest groups are the ones that are growing the most in terms of population. And that's something that's very crucial when looking at immigrants as a whole. I mean, for instance, since 1990, the number of immigrants from the Dominican Republic who are older increased by about 65,000 people. And the number of immigrants from China who are older has increased by about 75,000 people, while the numbers from Japan, Western Europe, et cetera, are much, much lower than that in terms of the increase.
What I noticed from your report, on average, most of these older immigrants who are now over the age of 65 arrived either in their late 30s or in their 40s. And even arriving at that relatively young age, because that's where I fall in the age group, it wasn't enough to make up for whatever shortfalls. Does education have anything to do with that? The education that they came with?
There are 2 major factors that are involved in this. One is how long somebody's been here, which of course influences whether they've had a job here, whether they speak English, whether they've been able to integrate, whether they know about services. There are so many things, of course, that you learn just from being in the country for a long time. And the second is, how well do you speak English? And this is actually a huge factor in something that was sort of a bit surprising in the data, and that is that on average, among the most educated in terms of having degrees in New York City are people from the former Soviet Union. Yet very, very few of them speak English compared to other groups. And as a result, they're actually among the poorest groups in the city. There are returns to education, but being able to speak English is one of those huge factors that makes all the difference, no matter how much education you have.
And based on the data, and if you can recall, how many foreign-born older people can speak English? And obviously that there are different levels of ability. There are people who may consider themselves fluent. They may have a working proficiency of the language. Proficiency is on a spectrum, and it's actually rather subjective whether you think somebody's good at a language or not. But based on your research, how many older immigrants can actually speak English?
To your point that there's many different levels of being able to speak English, and the census actually asks many different levels. It asks whether somebody can speak only English, if they speak English very well, if they speak English just well. So in our report, we used the number of people who can speak English less than very well. And that number is 2 out of every 3 older immigrants in the city speak English less than very well.
Which correlates to the difficulties that they face in navigating the city and navigating services and benefits. It's all interrelated.
And in particular, going back to the example of people from the former Soviet Union, about 80% of those who speak English less than very well live in linguistically isolated households, which means that nobody over the age of 14 in their household speaks English. So not only is it difficult to navigate, but also the fact that they don't speak English really sort of limits them to their communities where people speak the language and limits them to their homes. So it's something that could be isolating.
And that's something that I experienced growing up. Being from Queens, you see a lot of ethnic neighborhoods. And for people who are immigrants, that insularity in their neighborhoods, it leads them to a false sense of protection because within the confines of their neighborhood, there's no need to learn English because the businesses, the houses of worship, the banks, anything you can think of caters to you and to the language that is your dominant language. The issues arise once you step away from the insularity of your neighborhood and you recognize that you're not able to navigate a city that you live in.
Basically, being able to speak English opens the world beyond your neighborhood, beyond your community, beyond your family. And that's something that's crucial when you think about how far immigrants able to get in this country.
You talked about the provision of services that New York, and I'm not quoting you because I don't remember the exact words you used, is a city that has a lot of social service agencies and programs. They have a lot of places where older people can go, places where people can go and seek help, but that they are not utilized as much by senior citizens who happen to be immigrants. Can you talk a little bit about the lack of access that older immigrants have to the services that you and I know about?
Like many people, you want to be able to trust whoever it is that you're getting services from. And people from very different ethnic groups, I mean, really have very different feelings when it comes to receiving services or the idea about what does it mean to be in community? What does it mean to volunteer? I mean, it's like all these different concepts that are integral to services for older adults really have a cultural connotation.
I knew New York City was pretty progressive when it came to services for older people, but I had no idea that they had this many senior centers.
New York City has more senior centers than any other city in the nation by far. There are about 250 senior centers across the city that are funded by the Department for the Aging. And a lot of them work very, very hard to reach older adults, to include them in meal programs, to include them in health and wellness programs and nutrition programs. And over time, thankfully, little by little, these programs have realized that the communities around them have changed. That a place like Flushing, Queens, I mean, while if you look 40 years ago, it was a primarily European neighborhood, people who had come over after World War II and were aging in place. And now when you think of Flushing, Queens, it's a very, very different kind of neighborhood. And some organizations have been able to move with the times. And then there are others that have not. And one of the major questions is first of all? Are they able to have staff that speak the language of the older adults that surround them? But even more importantly, it's not just a question of translation, but it's also a question of interpreting culture. Do you have people who are either part of the culture, are from the culture, and are able to relate to older adults, or have what I and many others call the cultural humility to be able to create that bridge? To not just expect, oh, volunteerism must mean the same thing for everyone. Receiving services from the government must mean the same thing for everyone. Everyone has the same feelings about it. Not at all.
I like that term, cultural humility. I had never honestly heard that term. From my perspective, when you are an attorney and you're providing direct legal services, the concept of cultural competency is incredibly important. And the way that I look at it is when I work with a client, I don't assume, especially if they're Spanish speaking, I never assume that they understand what I am saying to them. I never assume that a person can understand legal language, and that oftentimes I have to break down the legal language into its elements, and I have to simplify my language because you have to meet people where they are. I just wish that more people understood the importance of cultural competency. And one of my pet peeves is people, and maybe I'm a snob, maybe I am, when people say that they speak Spanish and they truly believe that they do, they don't. Fluency tells me that you understand how complex the language is and you have more vocabulary at your disposal to simplify it. That's my opinion.
That is something that's very important. At the same time, you have organizations that, sometimes you have that perfect match where somebody is fluent in the language, able to explain, able to express themselves in an appropriate way that really reaches people. And sometimes you have people who are from outside the culture. One of the sort of big sort of triage moments in older adult services has been the contrast between organizations that have a deep knowledge and history in being able to work with older adults but are not necessarily run by immigrants or don't necessarily have that cultural connection to the neighborhoods and increasing diversity of older adults. And then on the other side, you have organizations that are community-based, that are often run by immigrants themselves, that are very embedded in the community and that have that name recognition and that trust from immigrants, but don't necessarily have that deep knowledge in how to work with older adults.
And how do you mesh the two? How can those organizations work together? Or how do you even create an organization that can better address those two things? Being embedded in the community, understanding the demographic that you serve, having that cultural humility or competency, but also having that deep knowledge. Like when I think of that, I think about SAGE. And I know SAGE is slightly off topic, but SAGE works with LGBTQ plus older people. They have their own set of issues with abuse, with discrimination, but this is an organization that has deep roots in New York City, and that's the work that they do, and that's all they do.
And yes, and SAGE is a great organization that has really gotten the trust of a lot of older adults who in the LGBT community. I also think about India Home. That's a great organization in that they're a senior center without walls. They basically say, well, we don't have an actual senior center to bring together the South Asian community, but we can bring cultural programming to existing senior centers. And if we're lucky, we can have the people who may be not South Asian. Maybe you can build some cultural bridges. So those are the kinds of partnerships that are really necessary. One of the big key words in aging has been aging in place. A lot of older adults want to age where they've been.
And thinking about older immigrant seniors, the thought of them having to move again, I don't know if that's palatable, especially if they've been here a long time and it takes them so long to become acclimated. I won't say assimilated because I don't know if immigrant seniors ever become assimilated. I don't know if they ever feel that this is home. But I definitely feel that generally speaking, people just want to age where they've always been. And I think that for older immigrants, the thought of another move, and I'm probably generalizing here, but is not appealing.
Yeah, the fact is that 9 out of every 10 older immigrants in New York City have been here for more than a decade. And many of them have been embedded in their communities for a long time. And in particular, when you're talking about those that speak English less than very well, their communities are their lifeline to the outside. That's where their doctors are, where that speak their language. That's where the community center where they go to take dance classes or whatever it is. I mean, that's where their friends are. So their lives are really connected to those communities, which of course means that New York City could potentially be one of the best places in the country or for immigrants to grow older.
And I agree with you, but there was a part of the report that really brought to mind where New York and probably other major cities are failing. Housing is one of them. You talked about aging in place, but the reality for so many people, whether they're immigrant or not, but particularly immigrants, is New York is not cheap and there isn't enough affordable housing for senior citizens. And I'll profess my ignorance. I didn't know that there was anything called Section 202. Can you talk a little bit about what Section 202 is and where it came from?
Section 202 is a federal public housing program that's particularly for adults age 62 and older. And there are thousands of units in the city that are occupied in this way. There are thousands of people on the waiting list. When your number is called up, you have a choice of 2 different apartments, and you have to choose one of those, or else you get put on the back of the list. You've kind of won the lottery because for the rest of your life, you'll have permanently affordable housing. But on the other side, it could also possibly be a big disruption in your life, because where the apartment may not be anywhere close to where you grew up or close to where your services are or close to your friends. And for instance, in East Harlem, there's a big population of older people from China. For most New Yorkers, when you think about East Harlem, you think about the Boricuas, the Puerto Ricans first. You think about the Mexican populations that are coming in now and the Central American populations, but you don't necessarily think about Chinese people living there who are living in 202 housing. And the reason why they're living there is because their number came up, they were in the lottery, and they ended up in East Harlem, and sometimes far away from the services that they know in their various Chinatowns, whether that's Flushing or Manhattan or Brooklyn.
Elsewhere in your report, you talked about Norks. And I recently interviewed a woman who runs a Nork in New York City. There are only 40 Norks in all of New York City. Only 4 of them are neighborhood based. So tell us what Norks are and explain why that's kind of a problem.
So it started out as a great idea of bringing services to where older adults already are. It's in fact a place that people moved in when they were younger, when they were working, perhaps raising families. And then over time, maybe their kids moved out and they remained. So they basically aged exactly where they are. So you have about 40 Norks that are like that are building based across the city. But at the same time, one of the expansions of the Nork program was to create something called the Neighborhood Nork program. And this was directly in response to the fact that not all of New York City is tall towers. And there are places where you have whole neighborhoods where people are growing older. When state and city funding for Norks was codified, they required that there had to be a minimum population of, I think it was 2,000 older adults. And there was a certain percentage of the catchment area that had to be people who are age 60 and older. And so there was both a number requirement and a concentration requirement. But if you're out in Flushing, if you're out in Woodside, if you're out in many swaths of the outer boroughs, you don't really have the opportunity to have that kind of concentration because there aren't as many tall buildings like Penn South, like Confucius Towers, like other buildings that are already Norks. And so the idea of neighborhood Norks was brought up. The problem is that there are very few neighborhoods that actually meet those requirements. You have neighborhoods that have a lot of older adults, but according to this funding requirements, there's not enough of a concentration of them for them to merit having their own services. So this really limits the places where more senior services can be placed.
So that's part of the reason why there were only 4 neighborhood Norks. How many Norks are actually servicing immigrants?
How many immigrants are being served by Norks was actually one of the pieces of data that I wanted to get for this report, but the centers don't actually collect demographic information in this way. So you can only guess based on the census tract where the Nork is located. You can only sort of approximate. And the fact is that most Norks are not really serving immigrants. That has to do with how Norks were created in the first place. I mean, these are people who very often have been living in these units for a very long time. So the populations that are reflected in these Norks very often reflect the population makeup of New York City from many decades ago.
And it seems like they're the ones clamoring for the services. Like they're actually vocalizing, we want this. And I don't know, and maybe I'm generalizing, that immigrants are very good at vocalizing, I want this. I don't think so.
That's the big issue there. You have some immigrants that are aware of what services are out there and know to clamor for them. And then there are many immigrants who don't quite know that those services are available from the Department for the Aging or the Human Resource Administration or the Visiting Nurse Service of New York. The more connected you are with, what you can be entitled to or what's available to you, the more likely you are, of course, to ask for it. Immigrant communities, you have some that have been around for a long time. For instance, Manhattan's Chinatown. Manhattan's Chinatown has been there for over 100 years. You have many generations that have grown up there. You have that historical narrative that allows older adults today to learn from older adults who have already been there and done that and know where to get services. And that's very different from, say, some of the newer groups coming in, like Bangladeshis, who live in Queens, in places like Jamaica, Jackson Heights, etc., that in general are lower density. In general, the community of Bangladeshis hasn't been in New York City for as long as the community in Chinatown. And therefore, those kinds of social connections about where to get what you need, who to ask, etc., are not as present in that community as they are in others.
So definitely having deeper roots as an immigrant community can be a help to you.
And when it comes to Norks, again, these are people that very often have been neighbors for a very long time and have been able to establish a community there. And that makes all the difference, having those roots.
Healthcare is an issue that is integral to any community. It's integral to us as human beings. And one of the issues that you highlighted is immigrants and their use of the healthcare system, especially those who are undocumented, and the inevitable strain that they place on the healthcare system and how some of them actually fall through the cracks.
Unfortunately, undocumented immigrants, regardless of age, definitely do fall through the cracks because they have access to almost no benefits at all. The only benefit that is available is emergency Medicaid, which is basically you show up at the emergency room and hospitals serve you. And that's something that, of course, it's clear to see how that's a danger to the health of immigrant communities in general, because often this means that without insurance, they don't have a primary care provider. And without a primary care provider, you don't have the kind of preventive medicine, access to the kind of preventive medicine that you really need. Eventually, you're going to intersect with the healthcare system at one time or another. And that's when you have a crisis situation where older adults living alone are not going to get the services that they need. And then if you have older adults who are immigrants who live with family, and the older adult doesn't have Medicare, doesn't have Medicaid, doesn't have those kinds of benefits, it puts a pretty severe strain on that family to do most of the caregiving.
That's a very nice segue, that the concept of caregiving in many immigrant families that live intergenerationally. And that's often a product of their culture. So it's not uncommon to have 3 generations living under the same roof. One of the statistics in your report that really just jumped out at me is that 76%, and that's a massive number, of immigrant older people live with their grandchildren.
3 out of every 4 households where you have a grandparent living with their own grandchildren are immigrant households.
So clarify that for me. Did I get it wrong? Because I don't want to get it wrong. What's the actual statistic?
The actual statistic is that of all of the households in New York City where you have a grandparent that's living with their own grandchildren, 3 out of every 4 of those are immigrant households.
That, to me, being a first generation American, isn't weird.
No, absolutely not. I grew up with my grandma as well. My grandma lived with us her entire adult life.
You're lucky that you had that growing up. You're lucky you had your abuelita. I didn't. That led to further discussion about a topic that is near and dear to my heart, but it's a topic that I wish I didn't have to talk about the topic of elder abuse and how in immigrant households, the added stressors of being financially responsible for an older person can lead to abuse.
And in fact, people who study elder abuse will say that some of the markers for elder abuse are somebody who is lower income, somebody who is isolated, somebody who doesn't have a lot of external connections, of people that, they can talk to. And of course, having financial or other serious strains in the family can only add to that. And in fact, a lot of elder abuse happens through caretakers, unfortunately. Family caretakers and sometimes other caretakers as well, but very often family caretakers. And in the case of immigrant communities, it's family that's taking care of older adults.
And I think your report also talked about the fact that because these older adults are isolated, that they don't know how to access help.
You wouldn't know where to turn for help. And of course, when it comes to abuse that happens within the family, it's also really difficult to figure out how to deal with that. Because if it's a situation where you have your grandkid who is taking money from you because they think it's like, oh, well, you're older, you're at home, you don't need your social security check, so I'll take it. That's a kind of elder abuse. Certainly, I mean, it's like if you talk to people who are working in elder abuse, they'll say, yes, that's definitely elder abuse. That's financial abuse. Yet, how does that intersect with cultures that say, well, families take care of one another? This isn't about elder abuse. I wish I didn't have to give away my check, but if my grandson needs it, then he needs it.
And that's funny that not funny, but it's interesting that you bring that point up because I recently interviewed the deputy general counsel of the Weinberg Center. And I don't know if you know the Weinberg Center. And I brought up my interview with you because it just happened a few days ago. And she brought up a very similar point. She's like, what if that person doesn't consider what's happening to them abuse? You look at it as abuse, but culturally, if and she used this example, if she gives somebody, her son, $20 to go buy something for her, and he decides to take 10 of those dollars and buy himself cigarettes, but he still goes and buys what you need, is that elder abuse? Is that something that older person is going to find objectionable? It depends. It's really, I hate to say it, but it's subjective.
Absolutely. So there's that subjective sort of cultural intersection that's crucial. I mean, you really can't say that you're combating elder abuse in different communities without really considering the cultural context of what's going on. The other important piece of that has a lot to do with how immigrant communities feel about having somebody from the outside intervene in their family, which is what ultimately it is that in New York City, we have a very comprehensive elder abuse system. We have a series of multidisciplinary teams that are comprised of geriatricians, doctors, law enforcement, lots of different groups that it would make sense for them to be teaming together to combat issues of elder abuse. Yet, when you think about it, the idea of having law enforcement come into your family and speaking to law enforcement about what's going on, in what ways are you being abused? I mean, to try to mediate the situation, there may be a level of mistrust there. It's a really, really tough problem of how do you make sure that that's a system that communities across the city can actually trust, and in particular, immigrant communities.
I don't know if you touched upon this in your research, but how many communities actually know that there are services that exist? Because I work in this space. So I know about the Weinberg Center. I know about Elder Justice. I know about all of these organizations that do work in the abuse space. What data were you able to find that either shows that they know or they don't know?
Yeah, that varies tremendously by country, region of origin, by neighborhood. If you want to reach out to older people from China, chances are you'll find them at senior centers. But if you're looking for people from Southeast Asia, maybe you'd have to reach out to religious institutions where, as you know, some of the temples out in Queens are not just religious institutions, but they're also sort of community centers where you have people from all different walks of life that come for the food, sometimes for the prayer. I mean, but it's a whole place where people can be found. And there are other groups that can be found in other places. So even something as simple as how do you even begin to inform a community about what services are available? It's hard to say. One thing that I'll tell you, despite that New York City has the largest system of senior centers in the city, only about 10 to 15% of older adults in New York are actually connected to them.
Why is that? But I'll tell you, it's an anecdote about my father. And I remember when he was in his 60s and 70s, he refused to go to a senior center because he wasn't old. And he had a picture of older people bickering and fighting with one another, and he wasn't having it. So he never went to a senior center, not ever.
It's funny that you bring that up because many senior centers have a bit of an image crisis where people see them as, being basements where people are sitting around eating food and playing bingo. And, some of that is true. But then there are others that are very, very different, where they bring in teaching artists to teach painting and art appreciation, theater. There's a huge amount of diversity. The Lenox Hill Community Center in the Upper East Side has a chef that sources all of the food for the senior center from local farms. And everything is organic and it's restaurant quality food. And not only that, but older adults participate in the kitchen as well, helping cook. And they even have nutrition programs for kids. But yes, there are other senior centers that are a little more than a room in a basement. So it's huge, huge, huge difference from one senior center to another.
And just for my sake and for the audience's sake, how do you set up a senior center? Is that a city and state initiative?
So the direct funding for senior centers comes through the city, through the Department for the Aging. And they get their money from lots of different sources. From the federal side, there's the Older Americans Act that was passed in 1965 that basically puts out money from the federal government for certain basic services. From the state come other pieces. I mean, for instance, there's a lot of mental health initiative money. Finally, here in New York City, we're actually very fortunate that more than half of the money that the Department for the Aging has to put towards senior services actually comes from local money. And that's a very different position from almost every other city in the nation where they depend almost entirely on federal dollars.
I know that your research focused on New York City, but how do the services for older people, if you happen to know, compare not only outside of the city, but in our state and outside of New York, if you know?
Yeah, the services are so different. I mean, first, when it comes to scale, of course, we're a city of 8 million people and the second largest city is 3 million people, right? It's like, so the scale is just very, very different. We have many, many, many more senior centers than the next city, which is LA, which has something like, I think the last time I checked, it has about 20 centers compared to 250 in New York City.
Wow. And there are over 1 million seniors. I hate that word, but there are a little over 1 million older persons in Los Angeles. And but 20 compared to 240 that are in New York, that's a huge disparity. It's huge.
Which means that we have a really comprehensive system here in the city. And one of those 250 centers is like a little laboratory that is figuring out how best to serve their community.
How does New York City compare to the state? Like, for example, Long Island, Westchester, and the upper counties. A number of years ago, about 3 years ago, I wrote an article about providing services in Spanish to older people in a competent way, culturally competently, specifically in my area of law. And based on my research, the higher concentration of Latinos, because it was a Latino-centered article, were in the 5 boroughs. The numbers diminished the farther out you went and the farther north. So extrapolating that to the general older person population and perhaps immigrant, how do the services differ elsewhere?
Fact is that New York City is by far more diverse than the rest of the state. Half of the older adult population in New York City are immigrants, but a good 26% in the whole state are immigrants. And what's interesting, however, is that although that might seem a small number compared to the US born population, the fact is that in most counties across the state, the fastest growing segment of the population are African American older adults, Latino older adults, and immigrants. When you look at just New York State, the growth of older adults outside of New York City, the number of immigrants has grown by 37% in just the last 10 years, compared to a 25% increase in the number of US-born older adults. But it's also true in rural counties, it's true in more urban counties, it's true on Long Island, and it's true in places like Wyoming or Livingston counties that are very rural. So that's going to mean that just as New York City is having to continuously think about how to reach older adults from different ethnicities, this is something that counties across the state are going to have to follow suit also as their immigrant populations grow older.
Economics plays a role in everything. And when we talk about state budgets, social services is usually on the chopping block and it's typically cut. In your report, there was a discussion about how services for older people, the funding has not increased in the last 10 years. It's quite the opposite. It keeps getting cut. So, for example, if they want to build supportive housing or subsidize housing for older people, guess what? There's no budget to do it because they're not giving you any more money to do it. So, can you talk a little bit about the almighty dollar and how it plays a role in older immigrants being able to age in New York or anywhere for that matter?
When I wrote that report, it was really reflecting the fact that under the previous mayoral administration, which of course coincided with the Great Recession and all the budget cuts that came from that, aging services really took a very, very big hit. I mean, it created this situation where senior centers and other providers of services for older adults were really trying to triage and figure out how do we serve a growing population with declining money. And to its credit, as the de Blasio administration has put a lot more money into services for older adults. And of course, that coincided with better times economically in the city, a slow but steady recovery from the Great Recession. But at the same time, up until about 2 years ago, the amount of money that the de Blasio administration had put into aging services was just enough to bring the system back to where it was in 2008. So at the beginning of the Great Recession. Little by little, funding for aging services was going up. One thing that's increased tremendously is the number of older adults. About 7 out of 10 senior centers in New York City are at or above capacity. And so what we're seeing is that despite the fact that only 10 to 15% of older adults in the city are served by senior centers, the 250 senior centers that exist are bursting at the seams. And there, of course, there needs to be more funding for more senior services, but importantly, the kinds of partnerships that would allow organizations that are not senior centers to also be able to serve older adults. The future of services for older adults is going to come not necessarily from a big windfall for the Department for the Aging to expand the current system of services, but in fact, from smart, effective partnerships with after-school programs, with museums, with public libraries, with lots of other institutions in the city that, although maybe they don't describe themselves as being organizations that serve older adults, they in fact do serve older adults already.
How do you see that happening? Because I agree with you. Libraries are, for many people, a lifeline to learning, a lifeline to recreation and to socialization. My local library, it's very diverse. So I see announcements for the Spanish club, the French club, the Chinese, Korean, South Asian. So my library, and I think that my neighborhood is very lucky, there's a diversity in programming. And so you're correct. Libraries are meant for everybody, but they become lifelines for older people. And so do community centers. So do banks. Because older people are just like you and I. They go places too. And all of those entities have to be able to better serve them. There was one anecdote that you had in your report, and I thought it was hysterical, but I thought it was really sweet. The McDonald's in Staten Island that became a hangout for Koreans. And they would hang out, read the paper, and drink coffee. And initially the managers were upset about it, but then they realized the purpose of it, and then they were cool with it.
Yeah, that took some doing, because the fact is that older adults, just like anybody else, it doesn't change when you're 60 suddenly, magically. I mean, they want to hang out with their friends. They want to be independent and go out in the city that they live and be able to do whatever they want. At the same time, one of the challenges of growing older, and if you're not working, is that you end up on a fixed income. So unless you have the money to be able to go out to a nice lunch and spend your money in that way, you have to figure out other ways of getting together. And the fact is that there are very few spaces in the city anymore that are really welcoming to older adults. When you look at a lot of restaurants, when you look at a lot of night spots, et cetera, I mean, it really caters to people who are younger. It's a big question. What spaces in this city are welcoming for older adults?
And you touched upon something that bothers me as an able-bodied person. It's the transit system. In a city as developed in New York, I'm still aghast that not every station is outfitted with an escalator, that there are insufficient numbers of elevators, even though between you and me, I would never go in one of those things because I'm claustrophobic. But I try to think of the level of frustration for somebody who is older, who has mobility issues, a disabled person who can't ambulate, and all of the things that they have to do to be able to ambulate. Like if they want to get off at, I'll make it up, 33rd Street, but 33rd Street doesn't have an escalator, they're going to have to go somewhere else so that they can get out.
Only a quarter of subway stations in New York City actually have ramps and elevators and other ways of giving access to somebody who's in a walker or a wheelchair. And as you know, very often those elevators are out of service. And that's something that happens too much. This is a serious problem, because if you're trying to plan how to get from point A to point B, you have to plan a route using the subway that will allow you to transfer at stations that have the elevators. And then you have to cross your fingers and hope and pray that the elevator is actually working so you don't get stuck. So it's hugely frustrating, which is why many older adults and others with mobility impairments choose to take the bus.
The bus is actually better. The bus driver will stop the bus, they'll lower it, they'll tell people to move so that the person who has the mobility issue has a place to station their wheelchair. Or if it's an older person, they'll tell you, older person coming through, give up your seat. And I think it has a lot to do with the fact that the bus is a lot smaller and that the bus driver has way more control over his bus than the train conductor has.
And it's also the infrastructure. The entire bus fleet in New York City is outfitted with that ramp that lowers down to the street level so that the wheelchair can roll on, or the person with the walker can just roll on and lift up to the level of the bus.
And in terms of Access-a-Ride, I have a love-hate relationship with Access-a-Ride. I'm very grateful that it exists. It helps a lot of older people and their companions get places, but it kind of misses the mark in some ways. Did your research at all look into Access-a-Ride?
Yes, definitely. As the city's power transit system, it's crucial, but it's certainly not an easy way to get around. So for starters, you have to book in advance, and the van may arrive anytime between a 15-minute window, and you have to wait outside for it, regardless of the weather. And also, it would go on a circuitous route to pick other people up. So basically, if you are going for a medical appointment, and you basically have to plan your entire day around it, because you have to account the fact to the time that the van sits in traffic, going around to its other pickups, maybe if the van is late in picking you up. In principle, the service is designed to help people with mobility impairments get to where they need to go. But in practice, people only use it for essentials like going to a doctor's appointment and other specific appointments. But the fact is that, people with mobility impairments don't just want to leave home to see the doctor. That's not the only thing that they want to do with their lives. But the fact is that limited and inflexible transportation options discourage people from leaving home, which of course leads to isolation. And if you're an older adult who is used to being independent and suddenly you're finding yourself with those mobility limitations, that's hard.
Is there any transit system or any system anywhere in the world that you think does it right?
When it comes to mobility, I don't have the data on that, but what I will tell you is that at least in the United States, every major city has a greater share of its metro system accessible than does New York City.
Which blows my mind because New York Well, it blows my mind because New York has so much population density. You would think that people would think far ahead, but our transit system is also ridiculously ancient.
That's true. The fact is that it is an old system. And in many cases, there are stations that, because of the way the station is built, it's actually not possible to build an elevator there. Fact is, I mean, there's a lot of work to be done there. I mean, it's like from basic maintenance to upgrading the signal systems. There's so much that needs to be done really to bring the subway system up to the 21st century. And of course, one of the realities of the 21st century that's absolutely needed, right up there with technology, is the fact that the population is also changing. There are more older adults today as a share of the population and the number in New York City than ever before. And this is a system that was built in the late 19th century. People live very differently now. And the subway system is.
What is your vision for the future? What were the recommendations back when the report came out, and has any of that changed for you?
I think that one thing that is clearer than ever is that a lot of what's going to be innovative and new and different is not necessarily coming from just the senior center system, just the system that is connected to the Department for the Aging, although there is a lot of room for innovation there. But the major innovations will actually come from the partnerships that can be had with other city agencies and with other institutions. Many senior centers, because they don't have the kind of funding that would allow them to create partnerships with museums and with libraries and with other institutions, often they're trying to reinvent the wheel within their own organizations. They're really doing a great job. What they're doing could be amplified so much more if they had the right partnerships in place.
And how does that happen? Or how do you envision that happening?
There has to be a fundamental change in the relationship between the Department for the Aging and senior centers. Right now, you have pretty strict contracts that specify what services need to be delivered, how many units of service. I mean, they actually use the term units of service, which in the case of meals, it's number of meals. In the case of health promotion classes, it's number of people who attended the classes. You actually have to hit specific targets for each one of these areas, which basically leaves little room for coming up with something new. So all of this really puts a straitjacket on providers who want to go broader than that, who want to have the capacity, for instance, to be able to partner with a different organization. But the fact is that if you do that kind of a partnership under the traditional model, if you have somebody attending a class across the street at the library, you as a senior center don't get credit for it. So there's no incentive for you to have that partnership that could potentially be great.
Christian used a word that isn't ever really associated with government or agencies, but like him, I agree that it's the key to the future of older adults in cities and anywhere.
And so what's really, really needed is flexibility. And in fact, if there's one word that really says, what is the future of senior services? What does it need to be? They need to be more flexible. Basically, the government needs to realize that no one agency can meet the needs of all older adults. And of course, the major reason why is because of how diverse they are, and certainly racial and ethnic diversity is an important part of that diversity, but also age itself. When we're talking about older adults, we're talking about people ages 60 and above. So we're talking about people who might be 30 or 40 years apart when you talk to older adults. There's 2 or 3 generations involved in that. The needs of a 62-year-old are very different from the needs of a 92-year-old. A 62-year-old might be thinking, well, what's my next job? What's the next stage of my career? Well, a 92-year-old might be having completely different thoughts. So even when you think about it that way, how do you expect one senior center to both connect somebody to a job in a way that's, deep and useful, and also connect a 92-year-old to whatever their needs are? It's too much to put on one system. So the future really is the entire city, every city agency, realizing that they are serving older adults. Older adults are an important part of who they're serving. Not just say, well, this is an older person. Well, no, that's the Department for the Aging's side.
And I actually want to stop you there because you reminded me that these agencies really don't look at older people as a viable workforce. Ageism is a thing. And when you also look at the reality that a lot of older people, immigrant or not, but probably especially immigrant or lower income, they're working longer because they have to. They can't afford to retire. So you have older people who want to work, but they're not getting the support to be able to do it. and they're not being hired.
In fact, one of the really hard lessons that we learned after the Great Recession was that while older adults were less likely to lose their job, if they lost their job, they were the most likely to spend months and months and months unemployed.
That's ageism to me. For me, when I see an older person, I think about all the decades of experience that they have, not only professionally, but personally. I look at all the knowledge that they would bring to the workforce, and also how, generally speaking, they're very loyal. They're very conscientious, and they have a very different mindset than perhaps people in our generation or younger. They view work differently. I think one of the issues is access to technology, because you mentioned it earlier. Older people have a love-hate relationship with technology. That's not for me. Oh, I don't know how to do that, and I'm not going to learn. So access to technology, it not only improves their marketability for jobs, it improves their connection to the world.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the fact is that there is this stereotype that older adults just won't learn new things, especially they won't learn technology, that it's going to be difficult to work with them because they're just generationally different in many ways. But the fact is that a lot of workplaces are actually seeing this differently. Veronica, you mentioned about how older workers tend to be more loyal, that they have certain qualities that are important. In fact, yes, I mean, a lot of research, a lot of psychology research, a lot of surveys, I mean, there's a whole body of research that shows that, yes, older workers are more loyal, but importantly, they have a lot of skills that in the workforce development world are considered 21st century skills. And those include being cohesive as part of a team, team building, empathy, communication skills, both written and oral. A lot of people in the workforce development world are saying, there's something soft about soft skills. Very often, those are more important than some actual hard skills. And older adults have them.
I agree with you. Older people definitely add value. They haven't lost their creativity or their spark just because they're older. But when you're shifting the conversation to older immigrants, how does that change?
Well, that starts not when they grew older, but even younger. Here in New York City, about 26% of taxi drivers actually have a bachelor's degree or higher. When you look at a lot of occupations that don't require a bachelor's degree and that are heavily immigrant, you have a lot of immigrants that are taking those positions. The fact is that one of the biggest gaps in education generally is adult education. People are living much longer. People are working much longer, again, out of necessity or because they want to. And so it also means that learning is something that needs to happen throughout the life course. Yet in the area of adult education that's targeted to adults, there are many fewer opportunities to be able to learn the skills that you need to be competitive in the labor force compared to if you're 18 or 22. And that's something that accumulates over time. So there's a stereotype that older adults are behind in their skills. That's not because they're old. It's because they have lived through the lack of a system that allows for that kind of lifelong learning. When it comes to immigrants, there are all kinds of barriers to getting the education that even exists there. If you're an immigrant who has a degree from a different country, there are barriers to even getting that degree recognized in this country. Immigrants face the additional barriers of that cultural and linguistic hurdle, having to take survival jobs while they're learning English and while they're, getting back on their feet. I mean, I know like my father had a degree in physics from Cuba, yet his first job here was at a shoe factory stacking shoe boxes. And my mother's job was to glue the soles onto the bottom of shoes. We had to do his bachelor's degree again, got 2 masters and almost a PhD, all with night school. Now think of how much work that is. Not everybody can do that. That is what it took for my family to enter the middle class. It took that kind of work. That's a huge barrier. That's a huge barrier. We cannot expect everyone to have to make enormous sacrifices just to be at the same level as US born people. And yet that is exactly what immigrants are called to do in this country.
Now, this is my final question, because you and I have been talking for almost 2 hours. I told you the time flies. I told you. What was the biggest lesson or the biggest gift that you took away from that project, from this research that you did?
For me, it was gaining an appreciation for the role of older adults in society and also how older adults have shaped my life. And it's something I really didn't think about before, but something that really shone very brightly for me when I was doing this project and since then as well. I mean, I moved from working generally around social justice issues to now being in an organization that's squarely focused on older adults. And I mean, as I shared before, my grandma had a very big role in raising me. You know, my father had 3 jobs at one point. Mom was also working really hard. And so grandma was the one who was picking me up from school, taking me back, cooking, disciplining me. um, Basically, I mean, it's like without grandma, it would have been even harder for my family to enter the middle class. You know, because of grandma's unpaid labor at home, both of my parents were able to work and get to the point where we were able eventually to buy a house, etc. Growing up, I thought that everyone's grandma lived at home. But all of these things are things that, you know, were just sort of a part of my past until I realized that that same story about older adults being a vital part of communities across the city, especially in immigrant communities, where so often they live in multi-generational households, so often they, you know, they're that glue that binds communities. That's something that's repeated in community after community after community. And even broader than that, older adults are involved in so many of the institutions that are crucial for helping some of the most vulnerable people in the city. Community gardens, libraries, there are lots of places that are run by older adults that without the work that older adults put into it, they wouldn't be able to run like they do now. And all of this is vastly underappreciated. But the fact is that what society is getting wrong is not just about Medicare or just about Social Security. It's about unleashing the power of older adults to do what they can already do for communities, what they're already doing for communities, and saying to them, you're welcome. And thank you for the work that you do. And opening up more spaces where older adults can use their skills and their talents and their time to be able to support society.
Thank you so much, Christian, for your time and for your words. I definitely want to give you a shout out for the tent, for the camping light, for the light from your phone. Out of all the interviews that I've done so far, you get an A+ for effort and for trying to create a mini studio in your home. And you have no idea how much I appreciate the effort. You get the award for effort. Absolutely. So thank you so much for your time and for your effort and just for the work that you're doing and that you'll continue to do. And I'm hoping that this interview will catch somebody's attention, whether it's la abuelita sitting at home, a family member who may be going through a hard time with their parent, not knowing where to turn. They'll find your report, they'll read it, and a light bulb will turn on for them, and they'll see a light at the end of the tunnel. Or if it's somebody who's in a position of authority, I'm hoping that they'll read what you wrote and take it to heart and do something with it. So all I can say is thank you, thank you, thank you. You can find Christian's excellent report, The New Face of New York Seniors, at the website for Center for Urban Future, which is www.nycfuture.org, or you can go to my website, agingwiselypodcast.com, and find a link at the bottom of the post for this episode. Thank you for joining me on another episode of Aging Wisely, the podcast. As always, I would like to acknowledge Adam Galchis and his family band, The Waffles, for my theme music. If you like my podcast, please subscribe or follow. You can find it on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Amazon Music, Pandora, SoundCloud, or if you spend time on YouTube, the podcast has a channel by the same name where you can find the episodes. If you'd like to learn more about the podcast, you can go to agingwiselypodcast.com and look around. Listen to this and prior episodes, and even better, subscribe to my newsletter. Every 2 weeks, the most recent episodes and the transcript to the current episode straight into your inbox. And if you like this episode, I would love a review on your favorite platform. Believe it or not, reviews help to spread a podcast's message. And if you enjoy the podcast or have benefited from it in any way, please let others know about it. I would appreciate it. Join me for another episode in 2 weeks. Bye.